Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ideas xLab's Uncovering Livestream powered by Switcher Studio. I'm Josh Miller, and today we are really excited to be joined by Stephen George and Ashlee Thompson from Louisville Public Media. This whole livestream series leads up to our Uncovering for Inclusion event on February 25th in partnership with OpenEye Advisors and Story Louisville, is to delve into some of these topics around covering in the workplace, inclusion, and how do we think about creative approaches to driving that type of change. We're excited for the Uncovering for Inclusion event that Butchertown Grocery Bakery is joining us as our food and catering sponsor. So that's an added layer of goodness that we'll have for the event. And before we dive into our discussion today, I really want to look back at a few of our past conversations because we've been building towards this bigger conversation around media and stories and the role that they play in a more inclusive creative society. During our first week, we talked about Deloitte's Uncovering Talent Report. And covering is the downplaying or hiding of at least one part of ourselves while we're at work or more broadly in life. And we were thinking about how that impacts the different facets of how we show up, our productivity, our ability to innovate, and our overall health and well-being. Last week, we talked about James O'Toole's Executive's Compass and this bigger question of what is a good society and can it be created in a world of conflicting values? We talked about some of the trade-offs based on how our values align and the identities we hold and how these things can change over time. We're not static individuals, and so those things can evolve. And we also talked about the role that curiosity plays when it comes to a willingness to listen and to grow with new information and as cultural contexts change that we're interacting with or that we are a part of. And so today, for our discussion, I want to start by talking about the social ecological model as we think about the role of storytelling and media as a cross-cutting factor for change in supporting a more inclusive creative society. And as I think about that, I also think about the role of courage, so bravery and humility as we think about what does it mean at an individual, a community, a city, a state, a national level, and as we think about Louisville Public Media and so much of the reach that happens there, how does that contribute to all of that? So that's what I want to delve into as we really think about the role of media and storytelling as that cross-cutting factor. And that was something that as Hannah and I were designing this series that was really important to us and really exciting for us is to delve into that discussion with you all. So I was listening recently to an episode of Hidden Brain that was talking about how social media and the reward centers in our brain are contributing to online outrage. And that there's also this increasing issue of cancel culture. And so when we put together these different values and how they align with things like cancel culture and this online outrage, it becomes a really difficult landscape to navigate. So with that, we can dive right into our discussion. We have a lot that we're going to delve into today. And Stephen, I want to start with you. So you've been in journalism for most of your career. In your current role as president and general manager of Louisville Public Media, you have a focus that hits so many of those areas that we talked about: local, state, regional news, and operations across multiple platforms. So could you talk about how you approach that media portfolio that's managed by LPM and how its evolution has been necessary as the way that we consume media and interact with media has evolved?
Absolutely. And first, thank you for having me here today. I'm really happy to be here and to have this conversation. This is a conversation, or at least a version of a conversation that we have internally and externally, right? So what's interesting about Louisville Public Media, and maybe a little bit different, is that we have this internal culture and internal focus that is a lot like other workplaces. And then we have everything external, which reflects back on us and which I think demands of us a pretty high standard, right? So you mentioned that we've got audiences in a lot of different places who are coming to us from a lot of different places. And it's important for us to be open with our audience and to our audience, right? So what does that actually mean? For us, we think media exists to inform, inspire, and empower everyone, and we do that in a variety of ways. I want to also sort of say at the outset that we think about the idea of being welcoming as inviting people to come to us, to consume what we're doing, to be partners with us, to connect with us in the storytelling that we're doing, in the music and art that we're sharing, so on and so forth. I see a difference between inviting and welcoming, right? And so it's important for us, I think, to invite people to come to us. What that doesn't mean is trying to be everything to everyone, right?
Absolutely.
So this is the challenge for media in the time we're in, right? If you look at it at a national level, places like Fox News or MSNBC or some of the loudest voices with, frankly, the smaller audiences. I mean, that's an important point to make about national media. NPR, for example, has about 25 times the audience that like the biggest Fox News show has, right? So they're loud voices, they're not huge audiences, right? But they have an outsized impact on our debate because they're zeroing in on a target audience, on a base, just like our politicians are doing right now in a lot of cases, and saying, we're speaking to you and just you, right? For us, we're trying to reflect. We're trying to include a variety of voices. Our newsroom right now is working very hard and has been for the past couple of years to make our local coverage as inclusive as possible. Internally, going back to the idea of sort of we have this external part of what we do and this internal part of what we do, we've been working very intentionally for the past 6 months or so about creating a belonging culture at LPM. That's hard work, and it's hard work particularly because we're in an industry, and I'm very frank about this, internally and externally, we're in an industry that has been traditionally very white, very male, and I think we need to work in an intentional way to open doors to more people, to have more people at the table. From sort of an org chart perspective, since we're talking culture, I have a very big leadership team at LPM. There are 9 people on the sort of executive team, total staff of 60. And we try to have a team that represents a wide variety of views and experiences. All of these things are constant works in progress, and so, but really the guiding principle, kind of getting back to it, is informed by our core values, integrity, openness, inclusion, independence, and being essentially a voice that is representative and inclusive in our community. I think that's essential for media right now.
I love hearing you talk about what does it mean to create a belonging culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a natural bridge into my first question for you, Ashlee. Mm-hmm. I also, in what you said, it brings to mind the quote from Edith Wharton about there are 2 ways of disseminating light, being the candle or the mirror that reflects it. Mm-hmm. And so how does media and the stories play that reflective role and that dissemination role? And I think that you really spoke to that. So Ashlee, one of the things I've learned a lot about over the past few years, in particular working with Wellness Edge and Project Cheer out of University of Kentucky, is universal design. Mm-hmm. And so for us, that's thinking about everything from how accessible is our website, is it readable, what are the colors like, to are our events accessible, how do we think about adapting arts-based activities based on either how people mentally process or can physically participate. And getting back to that question of a belonging culture, with your role as digital director and thinking across all of these channels, could you talk about the role of universal design and how you all develop that strategy to make it as inclusive as possible?
First, belonging is really important because, like, for me personally, I want to feel like not only do I have a seat at the table, but that I'm being listened to as well. And I think that's really important with that idea of belonging, and also with universal design and making sure that we're accessible to everyone, is being able to listen to when we get things wrong or when we could improve on things. And I think for us, because we're a small organization, we're a nonprofit, we're a community organization that serves the people of Louisville and the region, we're in a position where we can be nimble if things need to change, whether it's, hey, the font is too small on this newsletter, can you make it bigger for me to read because, I have a hard time seeing, or if it's, hey, I'm blind and this app is, I'm having issues with the talkback of this app or what have you. I think universal design really is about listening to people who don't look like you, who don't have experiences like you, who live a different life than you, and asking yourself, how can I reach them better? How can I listen to them, what they need, and then actually enact that? And I think it's a continual process as well. One website redesign or one social media campaign isn't enough. It has to be an ongoing conversation, and it needs to always be top of mind. Like at LPM, it's not diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And that's where it goes to that ongoing, continuous, we're trying to improve, we're keeping on listening. It's not stopping just because you think, oh, I've checked this box, because there will always be new boxes to check or boxes that you didn't think about. And even now in my role, I'm learning more about what the needs of the audience, are. Because before I started working at LPM, I was an LPM fan. I was a listener, a follower, all that good stuff. I am a member, which, $15 a month or any amount. But for me, it's thinking about the people who aren't in this ecosystem, who don't know anything about public radio or public media, and asking myself, how can I reach them? How can I let them know all of the great things that we're doing and get them involved? And what are the barriers to that? And sometimes it's accessibility. Sometimes it's just not even knowing that this exists, because I still have family members who are a little confused about, like, do you work for NPR? Or like, okay, so it's 3 stations, things like that. And so a big part of what we do is education as well. So I think to really foster a sense of belonging, it's constant listening, it's being adaptable, and not thinking that you've solved everything, I think you have to be willing to be like, oh, you know what, I don't know, but let me find that out.
Are there any, and I think both of you have reiterated this idea of being nimble and continuous process, and I think that having that ingrained is so important as you think about how you're engaging with people. But are there any specific, smaller learnings or things over the past few months or the last year that have really helped us shift or open your eye to just be like, that was something I hadn't thought about, but now that's kind of evolved and informed the strategy?
Sure. It's little things, like I mentioned earlier, about like font size, for example. I never really thought about it. I was just like, oh, I can just make it bigger on my screen or what have you. But we did get feedback when I redesigned our WFPL e-newsletter of like, hey, I can't read it, or I can't tell what is a link to a story and what's not, or hey, I'm colorblind and I can't tell the difference between these colors. And it's like, I never thought about that before. So being able to be like, okay, well, I can go in and change this, and it doesn't have to be okay, well, first let's send out a survey, let's test this first, things like that. If we get feedback, we can respond to it in the way that it needs to be responded to, which usually is we can be quick about it, and it doesn't have to be an earth-shattering, let's get a committee together and decide. It's like, oh, this is the right thing, and I don't think people will be like, whoa, this is too readable, I'm gonna need you to make it teeny again, you know what I mean? And I think that's what honestly the fun of it is. I think in these conversations about belonging and about diversity in a work culture, people leave out the fun part of it. Because for me, learning is always fun, no matter like what it is. If I'm learning a new skill or if I'm learning about a new community that I didn't have exposure to, it's fun to always be learning. And I think that's what we're talking about, is to always learn, to always grow. And and belonging, just like, it makes sense. It's almost like, well, why wouldn't you listen to people if they have issues?
I think one of the day I got into this role, the day I took over this job, I sent a memo to our staff, and one of the things I said was, I am going to be the person in this organization who says the words "I don't know" more than anybody else here. So please feel free to say you don't know, because we're going to figure it out together. And when you give, even if you don't, thinking about it in a very sort of, kind of antiquated way, where you have this hierarchy in an organization and you think like, oh, the boss is going to ask me a question and I have to have the right answer and blah, 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 right? being able to free people of the burden of knowing everything changes everything, right? It changes your whole outlook. And so one of the reasons last year that I moved Ashlee into the digital director role in this leadership position in the organization is because she embodies that, right? She is the curious, open, willing to be vulnerable kind of leader that we need right now. You know, we're at a moment in our culture where vulnerability is punished, and we need to create spaces where vulnerability is encouraged, I think. And so we try to do that. I mean, if you can't say you don't know, and if you can't take criticism, what are you doing in these jobs anyway, you know?
Well, honestly, what are you doing online?
Yeah, fair.
That's very true. And it reminds me of your all's willingness to partner with us in the past 18 months on the Tough and Universal series. And that was featuring people telling their own stories and being very vulnerable, because that's such a great way to disseminate those learnings. And Stephen, you kind of bridged into my next question already a little bit, but thinking back to the executive's compass that I mentioned earlier and those ever-present tensions between values. So on the compass, it's liberty and equality, community and efficiency, but really there are so many different things that all of us, if you have a 60-person team and you're trying to do this reach, so many things to consider. And so how do you all handle that balance and engaging as a team in those discussions and finding ways to move that forward in a way that is probably often somewhat uncomfortable?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Balance is the right word for it, and that's the way I think about it. Like, and balance is not, to me, being perfectly centered. Balance is knowing when to push one side to get closer to the center, right? And it's incredibly challenging. It's incredibly challenging for us because it can manifest in a million different ways. Because we have this sort of external obligation, right? If we were at an organization that was closed off from the public, that is completely different, right? It is completely different. But so much of our tension comes as a result of, and it's healthy tension, comes as a result of our relationships with our audience, right? So we try to do something, they say it's bad, right? Well, what if that aligned with a core thing that we wanted to do and it's not, right? I mean, it plays out all the time. We do a big project, doesn't land the way that we thought it was going to. Oh gosh, do we have like existential dread and go totally inward and say like, what have we done? We don't know anything, right? Or do we say, you know, let's listen, we tried it, it didn't work, let's move on, let's learn, right? I think it's also, I mean, thinking about it in the sense of sort of the culture in which we exist more broadly, right? And the amount of criticism media takes, individual reporters take right now. When I think about it from that perspective, it is, the balance part is knowing when to engage and fight and defend what you do, right, in a big way, and knowing when to step back and let your work speak for itself. You know, that creates tension in our building. You know, there's tension when we decide to allocate more resources to one service over another. You know, there's extraordinary tension in that. Let me tell you, and it's constant. You know, it's part of our sort of, over the past couple of years, we've done a lot of really hard work at LPM on reorienting ourselves toward our audience, right? So for years, public media in general was sort of an if you build it, they will come culture, right? So look, we make good stuff and we put it out there, and if you want it, you come get it, right? So the audience kind of grew that way over time. People aren't consuming media that way anymore, right? So we have to go to where people are. We have to be where people are. And so part of this reorientation has been a mindset of putting the audience first. We're doing some really big work right now on a new digital strategy for 2020 and 2021, and actually a few out years from that probably, hopefully. And it's going to be comprehensive. It's going to include every single one of our websites, every digital presence we have, and we're thinking about the way we're organized now, which is by service, right? So you go to WFPL.org, you get the news, go to WFPK.org, you get music, et cetera, right? That seems to me to be, I think to us, I don't want to speak for Ashlee, but both of us have been working on this. That seems to be imposing our organizational challenges on our audience, right? So what if we just rolled it all up together? And we had one place where you could stream classical music and read the news, you know, and you didn't have to click 7 different times. You didn't have to go, right? So those are the kinds of things we're thinking about when we sort of think, okay, let's not put ourselves first, let's put our audience first and see what they want and try to serve them directly. That enhances the tension, but it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's exciting to hear, like, I can't wait to see what happens as you all roll out, and if you'd like to speak to any more of that before I ask the next question, just as I consume media in a variety of different ways, so I listen to WFPL on the radio or on the app, but there are a lot of different ways to try to seek it out, and so I think that roll-up and more comprehensive approach will be really interesting. How do people engage with that?
Yeah, and I'm really excited about it because I want to really engage and get an audience that might not look like a traditional, you know, public media audience. Because, I mean, there's a stereotype that's like, yeah, oh, it's old white people listen to, you know, public radio. Old rich white people listen to public radio. And I'm neither of those. Hello. So for me, I want to get audiences that don't even know that, like, there's so much that we offer that you're gonna be into, right? That is gonna open up a whole new world for you, whether it's showing you parts of the community that you didn't know about, of your existing community, or opening up to the international world, the broader world. For me, that's what Louisville Public Media did as a consumer. You know, I was exposed to classical music I had never heard, or artists on FPK that I had never heard, or just knowing what news was happening without like a partisan slant on FPL. And I want to be able to present all of this in a way that is approachable and easily digestible for people who might be new to Louisville Public Media, and for the people who have been with us the whole time. It's like we're not giving up or forgetting about the members who are ride or dies, right? It's about making it welcoming and approachable for a broader swath of people and the people who have always been with us.
Well, and there's the space for that. And so you all are just expanding the funnel, if you will, for how people can plug into that. And I think there's also the kind of, not trade-off, but there are different ways of using your professional roles and also personal roles in how you're telling stories in media. And so my next question, Ashlee, for you, I follow you on Twitter. And so in December, you wrote a tweet that said, "My therapist gave me Hair Love a few months ago. I read it for the first time and got a good cry. I just watched the short film and had a good sob. Thank you, Matthew Cherry, for this gift." And over the weekend, Hair Love won Best Oscar for short animation. And so what I loved that you had all packed into this one tweet is you're talking about therapy. So there's something that's stigmatized. I restarted therapy last year, and it is tremendously impactful, but that's not something that we all talk about. And you're also talking about things that are reflecting back, like we've had in this discussion, things that are so important and so personal to us, and demonstrating the value of that. And so I'd just love to hear, as you think about your impact, how does that translate not only how you use your personal voice, but also professional voice in that broader reach and engagement?
I mean, as somebody who consumes media and someone who creates it, like when I'm not digital directing, I write creative nonfiction, so a lot of personal essays and things like that. And one thing that I've realized as a consumer and a creator is that if you don't see stories like yours, sometimes you think you're experiencing something all by yourself. Whether it's, I'm going to therapy, nobody goes to therapy, you know, or if it's, you know, with Hair Love, for example, it's a story that's all about like black hair, right? And it's so sweet, and like I'm starting to get emotional even thinking about it because it's that powerful. But it's the power of seeing someone or some experience that is like what you have learned. And there's something that's universally just beautiful about that we're not, and I hate to get like, okay, everybody slip on the rose-colored glasses, but there is so much universality in our uniqueness. You know, we think we're alone, but really, you know, we all love and we all fear and everything in between, right? And so for me, sharing my personal stories or consuming the stories of others, it really helps me feel more connected to, you know, just people in general. Because I think now in the media landscape that we're in, it is really easy to be pessimistic just about everything, whether it's politics, whether it's just general online discourse or whatever. It is really easy to be like, ugh, the world is trash. I'm just gonna log off and play Blossom Blast or whatever. But when you hear these stories and when you tell your own story, you're giving a gift to someone that is, hey, you're not alone. And sometimes that's the greatest gift that you can give somebody, is just to share and like we were mentioning earlier, being vulnerable. And that's really hard in this like internet day and age, because you show a little vulnerability and it's like attack, right? But at the same time, you never know that one person who you might have impacted in a positive way just because you shared your truth, you know? And I'm saying all this and I'm like, this sounds really naive, but I honestly believe in the power of storytelling, and whether it's in my personal life as a creator or in my professional life of what I do at LPM, we are telling stories of our community. And that is really connecting us all and showing that we have the same concerns and the same wants and desires. And even a project we have going on right now, Civic Assembly, that it's part of the Next Louisville project. And basically right now we're having a virtual town hall where people can input like ideas of what they think would make Louisville a better place to live, work, and play. And then they can agree or disagree with the statements of others. And so we've been seeing all these statements come in, and it's just been active for a few days. But I'm noticing that people have a lot of the same concerns about libraries, about LGBTQ inclusion, about the environment and fixing our urban heat island problem, you know? And it's really refreshing to see that as a community, there are things that we can come together and agree, hey, this is an issue, this is something we need to solve. So I've probably went all the way around the block just to get next door. But yeah, in short, share your story, it's awesome.
Yeah, and I don't think that the way that you framed that was naive at all. I think about work in Breathitt County, so more rural Kentucky, here, Natchez, Mississippi, and as you're engaging with community members, you're finding so much more shared than different, but the narratives that are so often highlighted are the ones that are different and polarizing. Mm-hmm. And so finding that, not necessarily balance, but more harmony of how we're lifting those up is the challenge of our time right now.
That's right.
And how do we overcome that? And that bridges to our last question, which is because of how much information we interact with every day. I don't remember the latest statistic, but it was extremely high. If y'all happen to know it, feel free to shout it out. But as you all think about, as individuals and as people in the media, your personal even self-protective in some ways, strategies for deciphering the information you're interacting with. How are you creating a space where you are at least seeing things you may not necessarily agree with, but are remembering that they are part of how our nation functions? Do you all have specific things you do either individually or as a group for how to try to make sense of all of that?
Yes. I think it's a really stressful time because of the amount of information that's available to us, and it's a great paradox, right? Because we have instant access to basically most of human knowledge up to this point, and yet we know less than ever about our city council or what, because of the erosion of local reporting and the economic challenges that have faced local newsrooms over the past decade or so. We're happy to be fighting against that trend, and we're not the only ones, of course. But it is deeply important for communities like ours to continue to find ways to invest in local news and information. There's my plug. My own consumption of media is a work in progress always, right? I limit my social media intake. Ashlee's not gonna hear that, but I do, but just because of my own personality and you know how what I read affects me. I listen. I listen to us, to our stations, and I read local news, and I read a little bit of national news, and that's pretty much it. You know, I try to really keep my consumption down, and then I have things that I like. You know, I like basketball, so I follow basketball news, right? I follow the NBA, for example, and that's my like tune-out opportunity for a half hour at night, and I'm like, oh, wonder what happened today, and you know, like. And I think it's important to have that balance, right? Like people, I think I've always felt this is like my parents talking, but this was instilled in me at a young age, this sort of obligation to like read the newspaper, right? And to know what's happening in your community, I think is as important now as it has ever been, particularly because there's less information available now, right, than there used to be. So that's vitally important, and that's sort of a key part of my consumption, and it drives me. But I always recommend to people to pick a few news sources and stick with them. You know, don't try to consume everything that's out there all the time, because you will be in a tailspin. You know.
Yeah, completely agree. Like you can overdo it, right? And you know, and I have a few like websites that every day I'm like, okay, what's happening at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, Courier Journal. I'm listening to all three of our stations. You know, if FPL, if I'm like, oh, I need a little break from news, I'm popping over to our music stations, you know. I listen to my parents and to hear what news they're consuming and what they're worried about, because, you know, they're a different generation, you know. Hello, boomers, how are you? That's not shade, like they really are boomers. And it's interesting to talk to them about the news, because what they see and what they consume is very like crime heavy. It's very like, oh my God, did you know that this person got killed, or this person, you know, and it's really interesting to hear like, oh, that's what they consume. And they watch a lot of like TV news and things like that. And so I try to take into account not just what I consume, but what others consume who may be in a different generation than me or a different audience than me. But also I do take breaks. Like when I just got back from vacation a couple weeks ago, and I took a huge break while I was gone. And part of that was so I would be refreshed when I came back, and kind of, okay, I'm ready to get back into that. And I think it's really important in our society right now. I mean, I know self-care is like this big kind of like, oh, it's a catch-all, it's cute. No, it's really important. And part of self-care is knowing when to step away from the news or from social media and things like that, because it does, you get to a saturation point, and everybody's is different. I'm sure that like, because we're around news all day, every day, our saturation point is probably a little higher than like the average person's, right? But whatever that point is, you have to know when it's affecting your mental health, and when you need to like, you know what, I'm just gonna log off for like, you know, the night, and you know, because guess what, it's gonna be there tomorrow. You know, all of these things are gonna be there tomorrow. And I started in newspapers, and so I understand the importance of daily local news and national news and international news. But it's so different because it's always there now. It's always just on your phone, just, you know, moment, all the time, all the time. Like, you know, we were talking at work about how I would like go home and log on. Well, ask my mom if I could log on to the internet, because you only have one phone line. And now like the internet is literally in your pocket, right? And being able to tell yourself, I can step away from this to get a good night's sleep for 8 hours, because guess what? It's going to be here tomorrow, and I can catch up tomorrow. And being okay with that, right? But also knowing, kind of having a healthy media diet where you have, you know, you have your main food groups like the healthy greens and things like that you consume. But it's okay to have some junk food. Like, I'm a regular subscriber to Us Weekly and People Magazine. I know it's just trashy celeb gossip, but that's my moment of like, I'm just gonna step away from this, and I wanna know what is in Niecy Nash's purse. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I'm into. And so yeah, just having a balanced media diet and knowing when to step away.
Yeah, I know that as I've tried to think about how to do that in my own life. Like you can now limit on your phone, you can limit how much you use apps. So I've turned on a limit on that because you just find yourself, oh, I'll just glance at this. And then all of a sudden you're scrolling for too long. But I totally agree that unplugging for vacation or a certain number of days just to like be able to refresh and reset is so important.
Stepping away from your phone is also a good way to get a nice balance in the points of view that you're hearing, right? Because I think a lot of us, most of us unintentionally, have established our social media worlds as echo chambers, right? That's not intentional on our part. That, as we all know now, is a very clear strategy on the part of the social media companies. And so, you know, being aware of that, being careful about that. You know, I like an example would be like put down your phone and like watch a little TV news for a little while, right? And remember what that's like.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a thing I do from time to time, or just listen to the radio, you know, which is, I guess, why we're in business. But
we definitely want you to listen to the radio.
That's right. But like you said it, it's balance like in anything else in your life, right? It's like the importance of eating healthy food and eating healthy meals, right? Like in balanced meals, it's the same. Healthy consumption, whatever it may be, you know, I think is best. So.
Yeah, I have intentionally on Twitter and on Facebook continued to keep people on my network that post things that I really do not agree with. Specifically because if we don't have that reminder of how broad people's understanding and way that they're interacting with information is, that we just forget.
Yeah.
Because it's not what we're interacting with. So
we're also like in this time right now for media, and this is something that we talk about a lot too, is like where it's easy for journalistic outlets to sort of become viewed as part of the resistance, right? And it's really important to push back against that. What will happen sometimes is that you do, say in Kentucky, you do a series of stories about the Bev administration, right? And it gins up all this outrage, and people are mad, and you're getting a ton of clicks, so you're like, yes. And then you do a story about Andy Bashir, right? That's critical, and then everybody says, well, burn them down, they're terrible, like that. That's the role of independent media, and it's easy to forget it when it's sort of going your way, from a consumer perspective. But it's important for us to always maintain our independence, even in particularly challenging times where our very existence is being challenged by the most powerful person in the country.
That is very well said. So as our kind of final comments, as you all think about these pathways or channels of inform, inspire, empower, and this idea of a belonging culture, as people are seeking to create that within their company or nonprofit board of directors or wherever they're interacting with people, do you all have a learning or a takeaway that you could share that may help other people who are seeking to build that as well?
Yes. From an executive perspective, be okay with it not being how you want it to be when you start. You have to be intentional. You have to be open. You have to acknowledge that that it's not perfect, right? I think a lot of people in positions like mine feel this obligation to make sure everything is perfect and exactly how it should be. And oh gosh, we have problems in our culture. Oh gosh, that's my fault. No. If you want to change your culture, if you want to make your culture better, if you want to make belonging a priority, then you have to admit that you have work to do. And then you have to go about being intentional in starting that work.
I think for me, it's realizing that diversity isn't just a catchphrase. It's not just something to tick off to like avoid lawsuits or whatever. Diversity isn't, it's just how things should be. You should have a diverse group of people who are leading your organization, who are part of your organization, because the world is a diverse place. It's not homogenous. And once you achieve that, it's that inclusion and belonging piece that's the biggest challenge, I think. Yes, you have people who look different than you at the boardroom table, but are you listening to them? Are you willing to hear them and what their criticisms are, what their suggestions are, rather than dismiss them? Are you making this culture a place where they are welcome to share their opinion without worrying about, is this going to get me fired or anything like that? You know, it's difficult. I was raised where it's like you have to be twice as good as everybody else because people will doubt why you're even there in the first place. They'll think, oh, you're a diversity hire, things like that. So you always have to work harder, work harder. I would hope that one day people who, you know, Black people, people of color, people who are in any disenfranchised group won't have to do that. And I know, once again, rose-colored glasses, hello. But to realize that so many good people, good and talented people come from so many different backgrounds. And all of that will make your organization stronger. When you have people who look different from you, whose life experiences are different than yours, when you have them on board and you're actually making them a part of the conversation and not just like a silent paperweight in the corner, your organization is going to be stronger for it.
Yeah, that's a conversation that even as a very small team at Ideas xLab that we have, like we have sat down to be like, what are the individual values and things that each of us are seeking to achieve, and how are we putting those up on the board and understanding that about each other so that all of that plays a role. Mm-hmm. Because even when you're able to all name those, then you're able to create together the impact that you all want as a group, or at least understand where people are coming from and making decisions with. And I think it was on our first live stream, getting back to what you talked about having to be twice as good. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I don't understand from a Black perspective what that feels like. Mm-hmm. As a gay person, it has been not extreme in that same feeling or way, but there is also that perfectionism mentality of trying to overcome. And so how are all of those things playing out? Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that you brought that up. So before we end our live stream for today, is there anything else that you all would like to share or that's come to mind as we've had this discussion around the role of media and stories as we're thinking about a more inclusive society?
I would say seek out stories that are different from your own, whether it's in the media that you consume, if it's reading a profile or a story about someone that maybe you've never heard of, reading books that we haven't really talked about that, but as a form of like love reading, read like a memoir or a book by somebody who looks different than you, to read about their experiences. Challenge yourself to learn something new about somebody you don't know, to maybe start building that plant of empathy inside you.
We also need to know, where do we find some of your creative nonfiction, if it is available anywhere?
Oh, mine?
Yeah.
Oh, so there's a book.
Tell us to read.
Yeah, Louisville Diners. It's available on Amazon, maybe in Carmichael's, by Ashlee Clark-Thompson. Just give it a little Google. And hopefully one day I'm going to finish the second book. Okay. But if I say it out loud, I'll have to do it. So
the launch date is in October, right? Maybe 2021.
Yeah, maybe 2021. Okay. So.
Stephen?
Just to echo what Ashlee said, put yourself in positions where you're vulnerable. Put yourself in positions where your advantages are challenged. That's something that's been important for me in my role, because I am a person of significant advantage who's in a role of significant advantage, right? So I have to be thoughtful and vulnerable and open, which is hard, right? And then from an organizational perspective, think about, like, I think a lot of times, I'm doing some work right now on this at LPM, and I'm thinking a lot about it. It's like a lot of people mistake values as culture, and how do you take your list of values and translate them into behaviors, you know? Because culture is behavior. It is, does it take 30 people to make that decision or 3? You know, and then who's at the table making the decision, and do they know they can make a decision? This is all a work in progress for us, and I am absolutely, I think it's very important for me individually to talk about it like that. Yeah. That it's like, look, we're trying, you know, and that's not the end. In fact, that is the sort of always, that's the default position. Right, is you're always trying to get better, you're always trying to listen, you're always, admitting that you don't know. You know?
Well, thank you, Stephen and Ashlee, for
you.
joining us today, for being really open about things that you're learning from, things you're grappling with, things you're working on. So thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
And that is the conclusion of today's Uncovering live stream powered by Switcher Studio. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like to learn more, watch previous episodes, or delve into information about our Uncovering for Inclusion event on February 25th, you can go to ideasxlab.com/uncovering. Join us next week for a discussion on spaces hosted by our team member, Hannah Drake. So we'll see you soon, and thanks for joining us.